Zoe had always been the quiet one, keeping to herself, nursing a secret past. But when she met David, a man trapped in a failing marriage, everything changed. Their connection was instant, electric, and undeniable. But in the shadows of their affair, betrayal ran deeper than she ever imagined. As Zoe navigated a tangled web of lies, the life she had built began to unravel. Laura, her best friend and David's wife, was about to learn the truth, one that would shatter everything. In the end, nothing would remain untouched by the darkness of their choices. Zoe had always felt like a stranger in her own life, a trans woman struggling to find acceptance and belonging. She moved to a small, quiet town, far away from her past, hoping to start anew. It was a place where the people didn't know her history. A blank slate where she could rebuild herself without the constant weight of judgment. But even in this new environment, loneliness had a way of creeping in. Though the town was peaceful, it was also isolating. She found herself spending many evenings alone, reflecting on her journey, trying to make sense of her identity in the world around her. Then one day she met Laura. Laura was warm, approachable, and friendly, with an infectious smile that seemed to light up any room she walked into. Zoe, initially shy and unsure, found herself drawn to Laura's kindness. Laura, sensing Zoe's hesitance, made an effort to reach out, and over time, their bond grew. They spent hours talking about everything and anything: family, dreams, and the struggles they both faced. For Zoe, it was a relief to have someone who seemed to truly understand her. Laura was easy to confide in, and Zoe felt comfortable being herself around her, something she hadn't experienced in a long time. Their friendship quickly became the anchor in Zoe's otherwise lonely life. Laura had a husband, David, a man Zoe had only met briefly during a few social gatherings. He was tall, with a charming smile and an easygoing demeanor. He seemed like the perfect husband, always attentive and kind, and it was easy to see why Laura adored him. From the outside, their marriage looked flawless. Zoe couldn't help but admire the way they interacted, their laughter and shared moments of closeness. She had always longed for that kind of connection, but at the same time she felt a pang of jealousy. She wished she could find someone who cared for her the way David seemed to care for Laura. Over time, Zoe began spending more time with Laura and David. They invited her over for dinner, and she was often included in their social activities. As Zoe got to know David better, she noticed a subtle tension in their relationship that no one else seemed to see. It wasn't something she could put her finger on right away, but there was a certain distance between them, an unspoken emptiness that lingered in the air. David, despite his charming exterior, seemed distracted at times, lost in his thoughts. Laura, on the other hand, appeared to be growing more consumed by her responsibilities, focused on work and household tasks. The warmth that had once defined their relationship now seemed strained. One evening, Zoe and Laura spent hours chatting over coffee while David was out for a business meeting. As the conversation deepened, Zoe couldn't help but wonder about the subtle cracks in their seemingly perfect marriage. Laura spoke fondly of David, but there was an undertone of frustration in her voice. She confessed how busy and distant he had become, how their conversations had dwindled, and how she often felt alone, even when he was right beside her. Zoe listened intently, her heart aching for her friend. She never imagined that something as simple as a casual conversation would plant the seeds of something much more complicated. That night, as Zoe made her way back to her apartment, she couldn't shake the thoughts that had been swirling in her mind. She had never considered herself a person to cross boundaries, but there was something about David's presence that lingered in her thoughts. It wasn't that she had ever intended to feel this way, but it was undeniable. Zoe couldn't escape the pull she felt, the quiet yearning for something more, a connection she had long been missing. But she also knew the line between friendship and something else was thin, and crossing it could lead to consequences she wasn't sure she was ready for. As the days passed, Zoe's feelings toward David began to grow more complicated. What had started as a quiet admiration, something she had tried to push aside, evolved into something deeper, something she couldn't ignore. She had always been careful about her emotions, always aware of the lines that could not be crossed. But David's kindness, his attentiveness toward her, and the way he listened without judgment began to stir something inside her. At first, she convinced herself it was just a fleeting feeling, a temporary distraction. But the more time they spent together, the more the attraction grew. David, despite his perfect image, wasn't immune to the weight of his own struggles. He opened up to Zoe in a way he hadn't done with Laura. At first, it seemed innocent, just two people sharing their frustrations about life. But each conversation went deeper, and soon their talks became more intimate. Zoe found herself looking forward to these moments, even though she knew they were dangerous. David's marriage was faltering, and though he didn't say it outright, the cracks were evident. He spoke of the growing emotional distance between him and Laura, how their once thriving relationship had started to wither. Laura was consumed with her career, her responsibilities, and she no longer seemed to notice the small things that made David feel loved. There was no excitement, no spark, just routine. Zoe understood this feeling all too well. She knew what it felt like to be overlooked, to long for attention and care. In a way, their shared experiences made them feel closer. But as the lines blurred, Zoe began to question her own motives. She didn't want to be the other woman, and she certainly didn't want to hurt Laura. But the connection she felt with David was undeniable. He made her feel seen in a way that no one ever had. There was an intensity in his gaze when they spoke, a quiet understanding that pulled her in. One night, after a few drinks at a quiet bar, they found themselves alone. The atmosphere was charged with something unspoken, something that neither of them was willing to acknowledge directly. David leaned in, his voice low, and told Zoe that he didn't know how much longer he could stay in a marriage that felt more like a friendship than anything else. Zoe's heart raced as his words hung in the air, too heavy to ignore. She tried to maintain control, but the pull between them was undeniable. They sat in silence for a moment before Zoe, unable to fight the emotions swirling inside her, took a step forward. David didn't pull away. What followed felt like a blur. The kiss was soft at first, hesitant, but quickly turned into something more desperate, more urgent. Zoe's heart hammered in her chest as she felt David's hands on her, pulling her closer. Everything around them faded: the bar, the people, the consequences. It was just them, lost in a moment they knew they couldn't take back. Afterwards, as the haze of the moment began to lift, reality sank in. Zoe's chest tightened with guilt, but also something else, a satisfaction, a sense of validation she hadn't expected. She had crossed a line, and she knew it. But in that moment it didn't matter. She had been seen, desired, and in a way, she felt powerful. But the consequences of what they had just done lingered in the air, threatening to unravel everything. Zoe couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. What they had started was something neither of them could stop, even if they wanted to. The affair, once a simple act of solace, had now become something much darker, and Zoe feared what it might cost them both. As the affair between Zoe and David continued in secret, the weight of their actions began to seep into every corner of Zoe's life. At first, the thrill of their stolen moments gave her a rush she had never felt before. She had always longed for love, for someone to see her in a way that didn't feel conditional. David gave her that. He made her feel like she mattered, like she was important. But as the weeks passed, the thrill of the affair began to be overshadowed by a creeping sense of guilt. Zoe couldn't shake the thought of Laura, her best friend, the woman who had been there for her, supported her, and made her feel accepted when no one else had. And now, Zoe was betraying her in the worst way possible. Laura's trust, her love, was being shattered by the very person she considered a close friend. The weight of it all was suffocating, but Zoe found herself unable to stop. Each time David touched her, each time their secret meetings ended, she felt the confusion settle deeper into her chest. The passion, the desire, was too powerful to simply walk away from, but the cost of it gnawed at her every day. David, too, was becoming more distant from his wife, and Zoe could see it happening. His behavior toward Laura was colder, more detached. Their once joyful conversations had turned into uncomfortable silences. Zoe could hear the frustration in David's voice during their late-night calls, when he would pour his heart out to her about the growing distance between him and Laura. He would talk about how Laura was constantly buried in her work, how she no longer took the time to truly connect with him. David's emotional needs were no longer being met, and Zoe could feel the desperation in his words. It wasn't just about the affair anymore. It was about a man who had lost hope in his marriage and was now relying on her to fill the void. But with each passing day, the guilt gnawed at Zoe's insides. Laura had noticed the change in David, and it made her uneasy. She had confided in Zoe on a few occasions, expressing her concerns about David's behavior. But Zoe, ever the good friend, dismissed it, assuring her that everything was fine. She didn't want to betray David or make things more complicated than they already were. But deep down, Zoe knew it was only a matter of time before Laura's suspicions became undeniable. Zoe started to distance herself from Laura in subtle ways. She avoided the deep, intimate conversations they used to have, choosing instead to make small talk or stay silent when Laura spoke of her frustrations. It was becoming harder to look Laura in the eye, knowing what she was hiding. At times, Zoe could feel the sharp pangs of regret, but every time she tried to pull away, she found herself drawn back to David. Their encounters had grown more frequent, more intense, and Zoe's desire for him had only intensified. One night, as Zoe sat alone in her apartment, she replayed everything in her mind: the passion, the guilt, the betrayal. She realized that she was losing herself in the affair. She was no longer the woman who had moved to this town to find peace. She was a woman caught in a web of lies, and there was no way out. The reality of what she had done started to sink in. Laura deserved better, and so did David. But Zoe couldn't bring herself to end it. The emotional pull between her and David was too strong to resist. But even as Zoe felt herself trapped in the affair, she couldn't shake the growing tension between David and Laura. She could sense it in the small moments, the awkward silences during family dinners, the way Laura's smile no longer reached her eyes when David was around. It was only a matter of time before everything would explode, and when it did, there would be no turning back. Zoe knew this, and yet she felt powerless to stop it. The affair had become a force of its own, a storm that neither she nor David could control. But even as Zoe felt herself trapped in the affair, she couldn't shake the growing tension between David and Laura. She could sense it in the small moments, the awkward silences during family dinners, the way Laura's smile no longer reached her eyes when David was around. It was only a matter of time before everything would explode, and when it did, there would be no turning back. Zoe knew this, and yet she felt powerless to stop it. The affair had become a force of its own, a storm that neither she nor David could control. The tension in the air grew thick, like a storm waiting to break. Zoe couldn't ignore the signs anymore. Everything was falling apart: David's marriage, her friendship with Laura, and even her own sense of self. There were moments when she couldn't look Laura in the eye without feeling the weight of the secret she was carrying. It seemed like everything was unraveling, but the worst was yet to come. One evening, Laura invited Zoe over for a quiet dinner. It had become a routine, one that Zoe tried to avoid but couldn't. Laura had grown suspicious, but Zoe still held on to the illusion that nothing had changed between them. The evening began innocently enough, with the usual small talk about work and life. But Zoe could sense that something was off. Laura wasn't her usual warm and cheerful self. There was a subtle edge to her voice, a sharpness that Zoe hadn't noticed before. They sat at the dining table, exchanging pleasantries, when Laura stood up abruptly and excused herself to go upstairs. Zoe, feeling an uncomfortable knot forming in her stomach, sat in silence, her thoughts racing. She knew this was not going to end well. There was a weight in the air that Zoe couldn't shake off. It wasn't long before she heard a loud crash coming from upstairs, followed by the sound of hurried footsteps. Zoe's heart raced as she rushed toward the stairs, a sense of dread settling in her chest. When she reached the top, she found Laura standing in front of a shattered mirror. The glass was scattered across the floor, glinting in the dim light of the hallway. But it wasn't the broken mirror that caught Zoe's attention, it was the look in Laura's eyes. Her face was pale, her mouth trembling as she stood motionless, staring at the floor. Zoe felt her stomach drop. She had seen that look before, the look of someone who had just discovered something life-altering, something they couldn't undo. Without saying a word, Laura slowly turned toward Zoe, her expression cold and empty. Zoe's breath caught in her throat. The truth was out. Laura knew. She had known all along. The realization hit Zoe like a slap to the face. All this time she had thought she was being careful, that she could keep the secret hidden. But Laura had seen through the lies. The affair had been uncovered, and now there was no turning back. Laura's voice, barely above a whisper, broke the silence. She didn't need to say much, the pain in her eyes said it all. Zoe's heart shattered as she realized that the woman she had once called her best friend now saw her as a stranger, someone who had betrayed her trust in the most unimaginable way. Zoe tried to speak, to apologize, but the words caught in her throat. How could she explain? How could she justify the hurt she had caused? As the two women stood there, an unbearable silence hung between them. The tension between them was palpable, suffocating. Zoe wanted to reach out to Laura, to beg for forgiveness, but she knew it was too late. The damage had been done. Laura's eyes were filled with anger, sorrow, and something else, something darker, a glimmer of something that Zoe couldn't quite place. It was fear, perhaps, or maybe something more sinister. Before Zoe could process what was happening, David appeared at the top of the stairs. His face, too, was drained of color. He looked between Laura and Zoe, his eyes wide with shock and panic. It was clear that Laura had confronted him as well. The truth was fully exposed now, and the air between them seemed to crackle with tension. David opened his mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. Instead, he stepped back, as if he couldn't face either of them. Zoe, overwhelmed by the chaos unfolding around her, felt herself crumble inside. She had never imagined it would come to this. Her affair had destroyed everything. Laura's trust was shattered, and David, though complicit, was no longer the man she had admired. What had started as a fleeting moment of desire had spiraled out of control into something far darker, far more dangerous. In the silence that followed, Zoe could hear the faint sound of her own heart pounding in her chest. She had lost everything: her best friend, her sense of integrity, and perhaps even the future she had hoped for. The room was spinning, and Zoe felt the weight of her choices settle on her shoulders. What had she done? What had they all done? David, still standing there, looked to Zoe with a mix of guilt and desperation in his eyes, but it was too late for apologies. There was no going back from here. The truth had been revealed, and nothing would ever be the same again. The fallout from the revelation was swift and unforgiving. In the days that followed, Zoe felt like she was drowning in a sea of regret. She tried to reach out to Laura, to explain herself, to beg for forgiveness, but Laura refused to answer her calls or even acknowledge her presence. Every time Zoe saw Laura from a distance, she felt a cold, suffocating void between them, as if the woman who had once been her closest friend no longer existed. The silence between them was deafening, and Zoe couldn't escape it, no matter how hard she tried. David, too, had distanced himself. Although they had shared their intimate moments, the weight of the betrayal had caused a rift that couldn't be mended. Zoe had thought that their connection could withstand anything, but in the aftermath, David had become a shadow of the man she once knew. He barely spoke to her anymore, his eyes filled with something she couldn't quite place. It was a mix of shame and anger, a sense that they had both crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. He was no longer the man who had confided in her, the man who had once made her feel special. Now he was just another person she had hurt. Days turned into weeks, and the loneliness that Zoe had once known seemed to return, only now was far deeper, far more intense. She spent her nights staring at the walls of her apartment, wondering where it all went wrong. She thought about her past, the mistakes she had made, and how they had led her to this point. She had always been careful to avoid the consequences of her actions, but now there was no escaping the aftermath of what had happened. She had shattered her world, and no matter how much she tried to fix it, there was no putting the pieces back together. One evening, as Zoe walked through the streets of the town, she noticed something that made her heart race, a flash of movement in the shadows. She turned to see Laura standing at the corner, her back turned as if waiting for someone. Zoe's heart clenched in her chest. She had been trying to avoid Laura, but the sight of her now filled her with an overwhelming sense of guilt. Without thinking, Zoe took a step forward. She didn't know what she expected, perhaps an explanation, or maybe even a chance to make things right. But as she drew closer, she saw something in Laura's stance that made her stop. There was a strange tension in the air, an energy that felt different, darker. Laura's shoulders were stiff, her hands clenched into fists. Zoe's breath hitched in her throat as a feeling of dread washed over her. Laura turned slowly, her eyes locked onto Zoe's with an intensity that sent chills down her spine. There was no softness in her gaze, no trace of the friendship they had once shared. In that moment, Zoe realized that whatever hope she had held onto for reconciliation was now gone. Laura was beyond the point of forgiveness. "You've taken everything from me." Laura's voice was cold, cutting through the silence between them. Zoe wanted to speak, to apologize, but the words wouldn't come. She felt paralyzed, trapped in the weight of her guilt. Before Zoe could react, Laura's eyes flickered to something behind her, and Zoe followed her gaze, only to find David standing in the distance, watching them. His presence sent a wave of discomfort through her, and she turned back to Laura, feeling the world shift beneath her feet. Without another word, Laura turned and walked away, disappearing into the night, leaving Zoe standing in the street, her heart heavy with regret and fear. The finality of it all hit Zoe like a physical blow. She had lost Laura for good, and no matter what she did, there would be no repairing the damage she had caused. The next day, Zoe received a message from David. It was short and to the point, but it carried the weight of everything that had happened between them. "We're done," it read. "You've ruined everything." Zoe couldn't breathe. She had known this was coming, but the finality of the message crushed her. She had lost both of them. The two people she had once cared for the most, the ones who had been her closest connections in this world, were now gone from her life. As the days turned into months, Zoe found herself unable to escape the haunting realization that her choices had led to a tragic end. What had once felt like a simple, passionate escape had become the catalyst for a devastating unraveling. The affair had not only destroyed the relationships with the people she loved, but it had also broken something inside her. She had once believed that she could navigate the world carefully, that she could find a place for herself. But now all that was left was emptiness, a void that seemed too deep to fill. The town that had once felt like a place of new beginnings now felt like a prison. Zoe walked the streets, but they no longer felt like home. Everywhere she went, she was reminded of the people she had hurt, of the choices she had made. The loneliness that had once been a part of her life now felt like a permanent, suffocating presence. The consequences of her actions had caught up with her, and there was no escape from the reality of what she had done.